Well, as talk of military action against Iran continues, the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, tells the world today that Iran will attack if it has to defend itself.
We do not have nuclear weapons and we shall not build nuclear weapons. But should the enemy be aggressive towards us, whether the United States or the Zionist regime, we will respond and reciprocate proportionally.
And big news today, a war game simulated by the U.S. military found that an Israeli strike against Iran could result in a wider regional conflict or a war and the death of hundreds of Americans. Now, that story was first reported in the New York Times. Mark Mazzetti broke the story. He's the national security reporter for the New York Times. He's here tonight along with Colonel Cedric Leighton, former joint staff at the Pentagon. Good to see both of you. And Mark, let me just start with you. I know obviously you broke this story. Tell me what happened in the simulation first. Israel was the first to strike, correct?
That's right. The war planners at Central Command in Tampa started the war game by having an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear sites. And they wanted to see what was likely or possible to happen afterwards. And the way the scenario played out was Iran responded not only with strikes against Israel, but thinking that the U.S. was complicit in the strike, they also launched strikes against U.S. forces in the Gulf, and specifically launched a missile strike that hit a U.S. frigate, killing about 200 sailors. The people we talked to said this was one scenario, but it was interesting how it played out, and it had a sort of indelible mark on the commanders at CENTCOM, because they sort of are trying to figure out how to keep the United States out of it, and they think it might be difficult.
Right, and you had also talked about, in addition to perhaps 200 armed forces members dying, that there could be so-called asymmetric responses, right, where Iranian-sponsored terror groups could engage in terror attacks in other countries, perhaps the United States.
That's certainly a big concern in the military. They didn't include that in this simulation, but one of the big fears is that instead of doing the sort of standard missile strike in retaliation, they would use Hezbollah or other militant groups to launch strikes against, like, U.S. embassies in the region or other U.S. interests, and it would be harder to sort of control even for those kind of strikes.
Colonel, how accurate would you say this sort of war simulation was?
Erin, it's pretty accurate. Internal Look is an exercise that I participated in back in 2002. And as Mark mentioned, this is one of those exercises that CENTCOM has done for quite a while. It is a very thorough exercise, and it is one that is based on as much realistic intelligence as you can possibly use to craft the scenario and also to see what the responses would be. And they did a pretty good job from what I can tell.
And what would you say, Colonel, this means in terms of what the U.S. military is assuming the likelihood of such a situation is?
Well, Erin, I would say they think it's at least above 60% likelihood. It is one of those areas where you try to plan for the worst case and hope for the best case. But the military philosophy is obviously to prepare as much as they possibly can in order to avoid a surprise or to avoid a worst case scenario such as the loss of over 200 sailors.
Mark, interesting question. Interesting there about the odds. That doesn't mean that they are sure it's going to happen, but a 60% perhaps chance. But I think, Mark, one of the most interesting things about your reporting was that even with this situation, there wouldn't be a big setback for the Iranian nuclear program, correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, people would debate on what is a big setback. The way that the game played out was that the original Israeli strike would set back the program an estimated year, and that there was a subsequent American strike after there had been U.S. forces that were hit that estimated a setback of another 2 years. Some people would argue that's quite significant and worth it. Others would say, is it worth risking a regional war for merely setting it back a couple of years? And that's the type of thing that's not only debated in Washington, but also in Israel, and that's the crux of the issue right now.
And Colonel Leighton, of course, I know that some of the simulation, the main simulation that Mark's talking about, didn't assume that the United States actually came out with some of those massive 30,000 the 30,000 ton MOPs, as you call them, the MOPs, right?
The MOPs, that's
yeah.
right. And, you know, the key thing about that, Erin, is that those 30,000-pound bombs cannot be delivered technically by Israel. They don't have the aircraft to do that.
Right.
They would need a B-52 or a B-2 to make that happen. And the only country that has those is, of course, the United States. So what you're seeing here is a scenario that they believe might happen, but they're also using it to prepare for other scenarios. And what you see is a way in which the military is looking at this situation and trying to work its way through different possibilities. It's kind of like a tree with many branches.
Final word to you, Mark. Any word of other types of scenarios they may have run? Was this sort of the most dramatic and dire, or were there perhaps other ones that went further?
They're certainly gaming for other scenarios. The reason why they ran this game was to, as the colonel said, test whether they're ready for these types of scenarios. So if Israel were to strike, would Central Command forces be prepared? Could they communicate? Would there be command and control? Certainly, this was not, as I said, the most dire scenario, because they could have used possibility of Hezbollah strikes and that type of thing.
Right.
It gets increasingly complicated, and this, as we say in the story, General Mattis thought this one turned out scary enough. So, but certainly they're thinking of possibilities that could be scarier.
All right. Well, thank you very much, both of you. We appreciate it.